Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between the two rivers. Between lots of stuff, Bud. Between big news events, basically, because we have a new pope. We alluded to this last time. But we have a pope that's like from down the road, and people have been making a big deal about it. I do know that Iowa Cubs fans had a little bit of a broken heart when they found out he was a White Sox fan. But the idea is you may have, if you were up in the Chicago area long enough ago, you might have drove by this guy, and he's now the pope.
Yeah, it's been kind of fun. You know, I think I mentioned this last week, but there is kind of a mystique around the papal office. It's a very old institution, you know, venerable. But so I think as Americans, it feels unique to us. You know, Italians have had the experience over the centuries of like growing up with popes.
Yeah.
But seeing someone uncovered like video from, I believe it was it like the 2013 World Series? And
I think it was 05.
Robert Prevost was in the, it goes that far back.
Yeah,
it was White Sox.
I don't think the White Sox have been good for a while. And the Astros had to be National League.
I was way off time-wise. Yeah.
Well, we can look it up.
No, you're probably right. I'm maybe thinking 2013 because that was like the first year of Francis's papacy. So I got these dates like fluttering through my mind. But it's footage, and you know, at the time, no one thinks anything of it. But someone went back and found Prevost in the background enjoying a baseball game.
Well, how do you think that like came about? How do you think someone figured out like, oh, I should go look at White Sox World Series footage to see if like they could see the guy?
Yeah, I kind of wonder. That would be an interesting backstory. I wonder if at one point Cardinal Prevost mentioned being at the World Series or something. The first thing that I saw was someone unearthed a picture, which kind of makes sense to me, like facial recognition and things like that. But I don't know, unless there's like this serious White Sox fan who has like the memory of being in the World Series like seared in their brain. And then they saw Pope Leo on the loggia, and they're like, oh,
that guy.
That calls to mind.
You know, it's funny. It was 2005. Do you want to know the last World Series title for the White Sox before that?
It was like Black Sox era?
1917, and then before that, 1906. And, you know, the baseball news keeps coming, Bud, because evidently after the new Pope blessed baseball by being seen at a 2005 World Series, you did see that they're going to let Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson. They lifted their bans.
I'm chalking that up to the Pope as well.
I know it's sort of like a jubilee like release of captives or something like that.
Yeah, I was always torn about Pete Rose. You know, clearly one of the best hitters in baseball history. Just an insane like get on the base guy.
I mean, someone who clearly, now that we have advanced stats, he's even more brilliant than everybody thought, right? Yeah. But
I know he gambled, and there is a real like I think professional sports particularly are like really careful about letting any sort of like questions about the integrity of the game enter into the conversation. But he never bet on his own team, apparently. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, in a similar sort of way, right, Shoeless Joe Jackson accepted money to throw the game, but then people point out he was the only guy who played good. And so I think, right, isn't the two defenses of Shoeless Joe Jackson is one, like maybe he didn't read, or like he didn't read well, or like maybe he wasn't understanding what was going on. And then the other one was, he was just messing over a bookie. Who hasn't wanted to do that? Because they said there's no way that you could play like he did and be throwing a game. I don't know.
Well, the thing about baseball is the steroids thing really kind of bothered me. Mm-hmm. And it was like Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire were great hitters just like at a natural level. I think steroids really helped them push through injuries than it had for previous players. But like the game changed so much. I think the ball was juiced, then you had steroids. But it is funny about baseball because you have like Shoeless Joe Jackson, Pete Rose. I think you could put Barry Bonds in that conversation, and they all got seriously tanked in terms of their legacy for cheating. But, I mean, not to say this is going to sound bad. I guess what I'm saying is like there are probably a lot of figures throughout baseball history who skated by.
Oh, yeah.
Because the game has kind of this, for us today, it's almost like the most aristocratic sport, but historically it was really rough and tumble.
Oh, yeah. If you can get by with it, then it worked in a lot of baseball. Speaking of people who do things right, imogene ingredients, Bud. If you're going to feed a mammal, particularly one that humans will eventually eat, you want imogene ingredients. I know that when I'm well fed and I'm a happy little cow walking around after eating, well, guess what? We can do that with imogene ingredients, who underwrite the uncommon good. We want to say thank you to Paul and Paul, the guys out there making it possible, and all the great people at Imogene Ingredients. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. Bud, we've decided to go full Pope mode.
Nice.
Full Pope mode. Look, everyone's talking about the Pope. Do we need another group commenting on it? The answer is sure, Bud. Why not? Now, of course, as we pointed out at the top of the show, the American imagination captured very much by a guy who grew up in South Chicago. Now, it bears warranting to point out he has spent a lot of his life all over the place. Peru, 2 different very long stints. Augustinian. He was the provincial head. Then he was the head of the Augustinians. He spent time in Rome, the dicastery of bishops. He really has quite the resume, speaks all sorts of languages, knows so many people, and I think that was the reason we got, as it were, a quick conclave. We can get into all of that. But I think when you have a new pope, it bears repeating and taking time out of your regularly scheduled program of what we're up to in order to talk a little bit about the Pope. So, yeah. Bud, your first impressions of Conclave Day number 2 when we got the new Pope.
Well, what stood out to me, what really struck me is since about the middle part of the 20th century, we've had this kind of like narrative about, it's called like the secularization thesis, that human beings in developed societies are becoming less and less religious. And you did have trends in that direction. Certainly on the show, we've talked about the phenomenon of the nuns, like those who have drifted away, especially from institutional religion. When they're asked to identify their religious affiliation, they mention like not being affiliated with any particular group. That being said, the secularization thesis has never totally panned out. And you see, especially in places like the United States, a real resiliency when it comes to the practice of the faith. Not on the levels that it was in different parts of the history of the United States, but certainly like a still strong contingency that regularly goes to church, things like this. Well, Bo, like that week really stood out to me because on major media outlets at the college, as I was talking to friends at, coffee shops and restaurants, it felt like everyone had their eyes on the conclave. Now, I've been upfront on the show that I do think there's a way in which, like, as Catholics, we can overstate the magnitude of the papal office. Like, we want to be careful. There's this kind of, like, balance in the church. So the papal office is so important, and the Pope is, of course, like the minister of unity across the globe. Like, being in communion with the Pope is one of the marks of being a member of the mystical body of Christ. On the other hand, you have the lay faithful, you have priests, religious, missionaries, and all these things, and at times in the news, the Pope can crowd out the rest, and we kind of lose that picture. That being said, I think there's something telling that during that week, everyone sort of stopped. And even media outlets that sometimes appear sort of like hostile to the faith or to certain commitments in the faith, they were all focused on Vatican City and what was happening there. And I don't think it was simply like, that movie Conclave came out last year and, it did well, it won an Oscar, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it goes deeper than that I joked about baseball today being sort of like the aristocratic sport. I think as human beings, we still look to aristocratic institutions. And what I mean by that is in the Catholic faith, our leaders are not supposed to be simply like, embodying the will of the people, that there are these commitments, there are these truths that precede any one of us. And our leaders are called to uphold those and to proclaim the gospel in each generation. And I think people, they're really compelled by that. They say there's this sphere of life where it's not like my own will seeking its own happiness, but where there's a group who's committed to something transcendent. and these commitments that, they don't change with the winds of time.
I think what you're saying plays into this idea of, the witness of the faith. And we talk about witness a lot, and I don't want to know if we abstract or if we, round off the corners or whatever. But, witness is a legal term, right? So, you have a witness in a court case and they testify, they make a testimony of what personally has happened in their life and what they, to the realities of what happened and what they point to. And even the word like evangelical or evangelon, like where we get this idea of the evangelical truth, is the idea of good tidings, spreading the good tidings, obviously of the resurrection and things like this. I've had case now multiple times in the past few weeks to point out that originally was a military term, that the good tidings were almost always about victory in war or the birth of a new emperor's son. And the idea was always about the good tidings of our city-state, our nation is going to continue on into the future. I think, Bud, one of the most miraculous things about having the institution of the papacy is that people can, like you said, resist it all they want, but this witness to something that is continually the case, that is the thing that stands out to people in a sharp way. And it is at these pivot points, right? The death of one pope, the election of another, that people have to sort of wrangle. Maybe they don't believe, but there's this witness to this deep belief that has gone on in a continual way. And whatever else they have to do with that, it comes to the fore every time that we have the succession from one Holy Father to the next. And I think that is, an important, when people ask, like, how the practical implication is this, what I'm saying, but is people go, well, how should I be a witness to my faith? How should I be an evangelical? And we can get caught in the idea of like, oh, you have to hand out pamphlets or you have to make arguments. But in some ways, without saying a word, just the sheer fact of the papacy is an evangelon of the witness to the reality of Christ. And I think the events of the conclave, the interest of the world, and even in America where people are super excited to sort of make these connections with him, this shows that witness and being evangelical is a lot different than merely saying a lot of words, but showing that steadfastness through time where the public can see it.
I'm pretty hopeful about how things turned out, and I say that, Bo, in this sense. Pope Francis certainly captured the public imagination, and after his death, I think a lot of the commentariat was like, what will the next pope be like in relation to the most recent one? And some of that conversation kind of bothered me because I don't think as Catholics we should hold our breath to say, like, will the next guy be on our team or not? Yeah. And we've talked about on the show categories of liberal or conservative, even traditional progressive. They don't really map on, like, is someone like Cardinal Robert Serra a conservative? Well, not really in the American sense of the term. He has some very traditional sort of like instincts and things, but like he's said some things about the environment and about the economy that would really rankle like the right in the United States.
Right.
That being said, I'm hopeful in this sense, and I don't mean this as like a stark criticism of the previous pontificate, but I think if you look at news surrounding the conclave and conversations with cardinals about how it went, that Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, united a broad swath of the electorate. Mm-hmm. And there are folks who, I mean, some of the rumors are being like questioned or like bandied over, but like it looks like he got support from folks like Cardinal Burke, but also, American, like you think about like Dolan or Supich in Chicago. But certainly by the time he was elected, it sounds like there was a real groundswell of votes, like maybe over 100 of like 133 electors. And so I think he can have a real ministry of unity. And I say that not as like a, how do you call it? Like a lowest common denominator.
Or compromise. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, but
right.
He's really embraced things. So Pope Francis, again, this isn't the time to like litigate his papacy, but he was well known. He was upfront about this, that he let go of some of the trappings of the office so as to emphasize humility. And if I were to give sort of a charitable read to the last pontificate, I think in some ways he read the Gospels and he saw Jesus challenging religious leaders and seeing ways in which like the historic commitments of the Jewish faith were sometimes applied unmercifully in their own context. And he sort of like imagined himself in a similar role. on some occasions, I don't know if like what he intended like worked out in the public eye. And when I look at Leo, so far he hasn't come out, I guess, like guns blazing. We can talk about some of the things that he said that have like a more prophetic tone, but he's kind of like quietly embraced traditions and things that had been sort of like let go. And so, I mean, his, like when he arrived on the loggia, he was wearing like traditional papal vestments. He's blessed folks with sort of like traditional blessings. He's prayed the Regina Coeli,
sung the Regina Coeli.
Thank you. Yeah. His liturgy, I would say, was like solemn and sober. And I think that way of going about things without saying anything about what's come before is going to have this real kind of like healing sort of balm for the church.
Well, on that note alone, let's just put it this way, that there was in the common imagination in a lot of church, at least commentators, if not everyone in the church, that if someone was going to, tend to liturgical questions, I'll just put it that way, that it was going to have to be some sort of battlefield. What I see early in his papacy, and it's very early to like make huge predictions, but as you said, there was a quiet return to certain things with little or no fanfare, and the idea is just, this is what we're going to do. And I think he does that a lot. You hear this multiple times from people that one of the things they notice is him as a cardinal in the many jobs that he did. And remember, dicastery of bishops, he constantly talked with bishops across the world, is they said, multiple people attest to this, Bud, that he would, it's not that he would hesitate, but you would see him stop and sort of collect himself and then make a statement about whatever was going on. And in a world with a lot going on, in a church with many issues that don't even, like you said, even outside of like what the last pope was like, just like finances, which had, there's a lot of things that go into that. Having a discerning pope, having a discerning father, I have to say, seems really reassuring out of the gate. And a father that's not going to, at least immediately, throw anyone under the bus, right? We have a lot going on. We have a lot we need to tend to. Quietly discern, how are we going to state these things? Very recently, for instance, he made statements about the Eastern churches. Yeah. And, East-West things, this is something that's been broiling for a very long time. And it's also something that it's going to take beyond great feelings, beyond even theology, but actually some sort of administration work. He goes to the Eastern Catholics, the church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of the primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the values so typical of Eastern spirituality. Constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. Penthos. It is vital, then, that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them, for the sake, perhaps, of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. Excuse me. Now, two things on that, Bud. One is the idea about approaching unity without forcing Latinization of the East is a huge, if anybody knows Eastern Catholics, let alone Eastern Orthodox, a live wire issue, one that Western Catholics can very easily touch and sort of shock themselves on. And I guess people just have to trust me on this one. That paragraph was done masterfully to talk about why it is that the East and its inheritance are so important. Eastern Catholics, and I would say Eastern Christians in general, what he pointed out as important will be seen as a huge olive branch towards what's going on. But then very selfishly, Bud, and we're going to return to this theme again and again, I love how often Leo XIV points out he hates utilitarianism. That plays directly into what I'm talking about. Maybe we can get into that in the next segment. But not only has he talked about the evils of utilitarianism in terms of things like economics and technology, sort of in my wheelhouse, but in order to like the fact that he said, don't smooth things over just to be utilitarian and convenient, warms my heart. That is the sort of discernment, the think before you talk that like is that again, the world sometimes needs popes that are like prophetic.
Yeah.
Sometimes the world needs popes that are discerning. I have to argue that I think we are entering an age that needs discernment very badly on behalf of the church, and it seems like the Holy Spirit helped guide the cardinals to a pope that, at least, like you said here in the beginning, is a very discerning pope.
Well, I love the idea of a pope who kind of exposes the falsity of some like false dichotomies. So there's this idea you were talking about, like you charitably said, Catholics who have an eye to liturgical matters. And sometimes, in American Catholic disputes, you have folks who are more progressive, and they see sort of like solemn liturgies as in tension with social justice or serving the poor. But as far as we can tell, so, when the news of the new pope hits, I think everyone fled to the internet and was like scouring for like, can I find something to kind of like confirm my biases?
Yeah.
And so there are photos of Cardinal Robert Prevost, celebrating the liturgy in a fiddleback, so a more like traditional vestment, a more Roman vestment, I could say, but we could get into that on a different episode. But there was this kind of like some circles that I am were like, does he celebrate the traditional Latin Mass? Well, that's still to be determined, but it does appear that on occasion, like he has, what word am I looking for? Like a respect or an appreciation for traditional devotions and things like this. You go to his Twitter feed, and he also has an eye to, I think, economic matters, the plight of migrants and things like that. And so again, he doesn't fit these easy categories. But what I appreciate is maybe you have someone who says like, is solemn liturgies characterized by beauty? Is that somehow at odds with our commitment to the poor and to justice? And I hope. I think someone like Pope Leo will say no. And this gets to sort of like his choosing of a name. So shortly after being elected Pope, he said there were many reasons that he chose the name Leo XIV, but mainly as an homage to Leo XIII, who in his historical encyclical Rerum Novarum addressed the social question in the context of the First Industrial Revolution. In our own day, the Pope said the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her teaching in response to another industrial revolution in the field of artificial intelligence that poses new challenges to human dignity. So if you know your history, if you know anything about Leo XIII, he's one beloved by what we'd call like traditional Catholics, but like could really throw flame when he's talking about, like the social landscape. I'd like to think, Bo, that our own show was prophetic in a way because we did a whole series on artificial intelligence. And the Pope Leo is saying there's this new revolution that's underway in economic, technological areas, and he plans to address those.
Yeah, I might be beaming too much because I'm literally writing a dissertation that like stars Leo XIII very centrally as the beginning point to talk about the technocratic paradigm that Pope Francis talked about in Laudato Si. But it's this technocratic paradigm that eventuates things like artificial intelligence, the digital world, etc. But that this is founded on a principle of utility and efficiency that mows over, this is, again, Pope Francis being against throwaway culture, but that gets at the heart of, how we disseminate knowledge and hand-on, understanding and belief and things like this. So when the Pope out of the gate is saying, I choose Leo XIV because we set at the dawn of an age where a new Rerum Novarum needs to be written about the social conditions of the age, but to me, when they were speaking in Italian, and I was in with a room of kids, so I wasn't hearing everything. But when I heard that it was Leo, I was like, oh my gosh, he's naming himself Leo after Leo XIII. Again, you pointed out, you predicted that, so good job. Yeah. You predicted Leo XIV.
I know. I'm really kicking myself that I didn't put it in writing, but I think all of our listeners know my wife Rachel as a woman of integrity. And she can recall like the dinner table conversation where I said this out loud. Yeah,
and but the when I heard that, immediately that was what set me off. Before I know a lot of people were like, "Oh, an American," but this idea of ever ancient, ever new, that it is precisely our tradition that has something to say to the most pressing questions in the here and now. That are questions not only of, as it were, personal reality, but of social realities, and that the world of what we do about those who are poor, those who are downcast, those who are not participatory in our societies, that they will hinge on the technological revolutions. Mm-hmm. This is precisely the time and the place for these things to be talked about. And we're going to be talking about them more here in a bit. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr coming to you this weekend. Thank you for listening to the show, and thank you for Imogene Ingredients support of The Uncommon Good. We are glad to be in your fleet. Imagine our show as a tasty morsel spiritually that is analogous to the food and the wonderful ingredients they have for your livestock. I'm going to keep the metaphor there. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients. Bud, so we've been talking about Pope Leo XIV because we're in Pope mode.
Yeah.
Pope mode. And it makes sense to do so because it's not like every day that you get a new pope. And, but I'm glad that we waited a little bit because we actually have quite a bit of stuff he's already done, to be honest.
Yeah.
So not only do we have some of the articles that we want to make mention of that we've already made mention of, but it's what a time to be alive, but that in 2025, everybody has a chance to go, do I know this Pope personally? So, for instance, folks I know back in Oklahoma, Cassia Hall, they pointed out that he was on their board because he was, the head of the Augustinian order. And so he had actually been through Tulsa, swung through a few times, and actually, I think, performed the mass of a funeral of one of the very central Augustinian priests down there. So many sort of stories like this besides, like the world over, because he really has been throughout the world, but particularly in the United States, and then, of course, in his beloved Peru.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to return in the second segment to something we discussed just a little bit last week. We talked about how it was surprising that he was American, so grew up in Chicago, has spent a large portion of his ministry in Peru, so that sort of context, but has that American background. And this was surprising to a lot of folks because there was this kind of unwritten rule in ecclesial politics that Cardinal Francis George said at one point that there would not be an American pope as long as America was a global superpower. So maybe that says something about our status in the world. But long story short, America, the United States, exercises such a large influence on the global political scene. The idea was they already have their voice. And so having someone in the highest office of the church, maybe that's not the most prudent idea. I think it goes even deeper than that, Bo. Of course, for decades upon decades, it was always an Italian. And it wasn't until John Paul II that we broke this, I can't even remember, 4 centuries or something of it was straight Italian popes.
Yeah, I would have to look it up real quick. But significant amount of years.
But that being said, so this has caught the public's imagination as well. And it's, it's kind of a dangerous game to try to plumb too much the minds of the electors. But I wonder, with all that's going on in the world, so the United States, as I said, still has resilient Catholic practice, especially with the influx of Catholics from other parts of the world and things. And but it also has some thorny issues. I think it's fair to say we're one of the more rambunctious groups in the church.
No.
Some of our arguments are particularly
amplified,
vigorous and things like this. And so I think having someone who's from America, grew up here, but understands the global scene, served as a missionary. I mean, this kind of is continuity with Pope Francis' emphasis on a missionary church, that might serve a good function in the life of the church. That's not really a poetic way of putting it, but this comes up. So it was funny this past week, Pope Francis, after an address, he was walking through the crowd, sort of shaking hands, giving blessings.
Pope Leo.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Pope Leo. Still, I'm adjusting.
Yep.
And there was someone in the crowd, maybe a journalist. I didn't catch who asked him, but they said, any message for the United States? And Pope Leo responded, many. And when you hear that, there's a way in which it can sound menacing. Obviously, I don't think that was his intention, but I think the vibe that I got from his posture and the way that he delivered it, sort of almost lightheartedly, he was sort of saying, as a father, as someone who grew up in Chicago, who's met many bishops, I understand what's taking place on the ground. And so I've got a lot of things to say, and I think there's a way in which a good father will push you. We think about the fathers that we love, right? Even with sports and things, it's not that they always told us great play regardless of how things went on the field. They were always pushing us to be better and greater. And I think Leo, to me, I just interpret it as this kind of humble response, yeah, I've got a few words and we'll say those in due time.
Now, I have to admit, if you're just talking about Beau Bonner wish lists. The first report was that he wasn't going to have any social media accounts.
Yeah.
And I was going to be over the moon if that was the case. That would have been so awesome. He did take over the social media accounts, but even with what he's sort of written, again, I kind of I'm rolling with that impression, Bud, that the sort of measured way, right? To be able to say one word, so he has many things to say, but then to sort of hint at that there's many things that we can learn from that word. I'm with you that that's like a synecdoche of what I see so far with what he's done. He's been very intentional in the things he's done. He went to Our Lady of Good Counsel, which is a very important Marian shrine for the Augustinians. But then he consecrated himself to Our Lady of Fatima on the feast day, right? His Marian devotion has already shown out very much so. But then even the sort of almost tenacity of how often he's mentioned the resurrection, but without it being, I don't know the right. I'm blanking on a word here too, but it's consistent, right? Yeah. He's consistently talking about the hope and reality of the resurrection. Now, of course, that might just because it might be Easter season, but if you're asking me to make prognostications, which is stupid to do very early on, it does seem to me, and like I think some of the other things that read through when he was bishop and cardinal, that the resurrection for him is this foundational lens to read anything else through. And so if we're not going to read it in the lens of the resurrection, then we're going to misread the signs of the times.
Yeah. And I think he, as far as I can tell, he seems to have a keen sense of sort of the cultural landscape. I particularly appreciated his first homily after, when I say first homily, after saying Mass for the first time as Pope, he gave a homily, or in the context of the Mass. And there's a section of that homily where he gets into our Lord's question where he says, who do people say that I am? He says, when the incarnate word comes on the scene in human history, there are these different responses. Like the world, he says, the world, like as we use that term, they were provoked, like there was this perfect love and all that they knew to do was to crucify it. He said there are others, and he kind of uses these things as like symbols or like a pattern of responses to Christ throughout history. There are others, he says, like many unbelievers, they don't see Christ as like a charlatan or anything, but he's kind of like a guru or a good teacher. But then he turns, I think a great preacher always focuses on like not on how other people are failing the case, but he turns it interior to the church. He says, today too, there are many settings in which Jesus, although appreciated as a man, is reduced to a kind of charismatic leader or superman. This is true not only among non-believers, but also among many baptized Christians who thus end up living at this level in a state of practical atheism. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated that, not only for those who are listening there at Mass, but in my own life, where he says there's this way where we can take Christ, and you think about Christ being the Son of God and the presence of God in the world, and we sort of live our lives or respond to the call to conversion by saying like, well, this was a great man. We could even call him like a charismatic superman, but he's not, we don't respond in such a way where our actions show like he's the divine King, Lord of Lords, right? And that phrase, practical atheism, I think that's convicting for many of us. Like, we profess these things with our words, but our lives play out in very similar ways to someone who has no belief at all. And so, I don't know, I appreciated the fact that leading with Christ, you mentioned, a lot of times in his messages, he says, peace be with you. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't let that just hang as sort of like a kind of phrase that people can fill with their own meaning. He's kind of unpacked it and said, this is the first message of the risen Lord. And it has implications. It has implications in Palestine and Ukraine. And here, I think this can be challenging for us who maybe are in context with like, there's not that kind of overt violence or persecution, but a kind of, our temptation more is to like fall asleep, to have this kind of laziness and satiety and just kind of like, killed to death by affluence.
Yeah, and I think he gets at this this connects with what you were saying about modernity, technology. He's talked about mass media quite a bit. He had an entire short talk that he gave to mass media sort of out of the gate, right, and was telling them their role in presenting the world and its possibilities for peace. But, Bud, like everyone else living in the digital age, I started going back and looking at things that he said before he was Pope. And so one of these I think is very salient, not only to what we're just saying, but also like we're mass media, right? We're here on the radio. So when he was prior general of the Augustinians, he gave this talk in 2012 to the Synod of Bishops in Rome. So just a few paragraphs. At least in the contemporary Western world, if not throughout the entire world, the human imagination concerning both religious faith and ethics is largely shaped by mass media, especially television and cinema. Not quite talking about the digital world yet, but he would soon, right? Western mass media is extraordinarily effective in fostering within general public enormous sympathy for beliefs and practices that are at odds with the gospel. Religion is best tolerated by mass media as tame and quaint. This gets exactly to what you said about practical atheism. So mass media will tolerate religion if it's tame and quaint, when it does not actively oppose positions on ethical issues that the media have embraced as their own. However, when religious voices are raised in opposition to these positions, mass media can target religion, labeling it as ideological and insensitive in regard to the so-called vital needs of people in the contemporary world. In a world dominated by mass media, magisterial church teaching can be helpful, yet there is a great need for further development in this area. And so his idea, right, is the distortion that modern media and rhetoric takes can be elemental in fomenting like all of these divides that we're talking about, misunderstanding things, leaving things vague, tame, and quaint. And so this gets back to it, right, that if he goes, peace be with you, everyone's like, oh, a peaceful Pope, that's so great. And he goes, these are the words of the risen Christ. And just with that, but again, a small statement, that starts to cut against the sort of spectacle that mass media allows within its sort of range for religion and makes it incarnate. This is what Christ said. You can't have this peace without Christ, is what he's saying.
Well, and I love in that same address where he warns against the church trying to fight fire with fire, in the sense like, we'll just compete with the mass media at the level of spectacle. And then he gets into this historical treatment where he's drawn on church fathers and the danger of spectacle. But he says something very insightful. He says we have to kind of like treat the wound with mystery, that if we just kind of ape what the world's doing, they'll oftentimes beat us at our own game. I mean, this is about, being wise as how's that? Peaceful as doves, wise as serpents, or foxes.
It's wise as serpents and simple as doves.
Simple as doves, right? And so I feel like, not to be too aggrandizing, I hope, but like with Iowa Catholic Radio, that's part of our ministry.
Absolutely.
Where we've said like people are being influenced by digital media, television media, etc. And all these messages are going out throughout the world and throughout society like every hour of the day. And there's a way in which we could say like, well, we're just going to try to always keep up with the curve. I think strategically we found radio to be a form of messaging that reaches a lot of people, but it does require a certain level of discipline and I'd say like slowness in a good sense of the term, where if you're using an app like Twitter, for one thing, all the messaging that's coming to you is curated based on algorithms and your use of that very app and other apps. And a lot of times we kind of even like, we curate it further, so to speak, by choosing what we want to hear and not hear. And if I get bored on that app, I can turn to whatever voice like I find most appealing. Here on the radio, I mean, I think, obviously folks listen in for the particular programming, but it's kind of like the church. We feel like we have this like messaging and these commitments that precede the founding of a radio station and that inform or should inform everything that we do. And so hopefully we're finding that sort of like strategic place where we're still connecting. I think we are connecting with listeners who might not otherwise hear the gospel, but it has, I think, this kind of like challenging quality that maybe is easier to avoid in the use of other media.
Well, and this goes back to like you're saying, I feel hearkened to that when Pope Leo XIV gave an address to the media that, like, Bud, we're part of the media. I mean, so we have an American Pope, and then also I'm like, oh, I'm on the radio, right? The two things he said in this most recent address, right? He goes, the way we communicate is of fundamental importance. So not just what we say. This goes, what are we harping on all the time, Bud? Medium is the message. The form is as important as the content. So the way we communicate is of fundamental importance. We must say no to the war of words and images. We must reject the paradigm of war. And that can seem far-fetched until you think about the people will talk about like the war for viewers, right? Or, the war for numbers. We do have a very sort of confrontational way that we will speak about the media, right? And like, so we think about it in terms of sides, and like, they will say they're lobbing volleys of accusations against each other. Mm-hmm. Can we escape that? Just like, can we escape a technocratic paradigm, which means like the sort of full encapsulation of what we say? Can we do that? And the same with media. And then the other one, you are the forefront of repeating on conflicts and aspirations for peace. So it gets very practical.
Yeah.
On situations of injustices and poverty, and on the silent work of so many people striving to create a better world, Leo said. For this reason, I ask you to choose consciously and courageously the path of communication in favor of peace. I wonder how often, Bud, we think of that we can choose a path for peace in communication. Yeah. That might be one of the more interesting ways to put it.
Well, and this is where his emphasis on mystery as opposed to spectacle dovetails real nicely with what he said about the liturgy. And Bo, it's at the point in the episode where I want to say, as Catholics, we shouldn't wait around and just say like, well, I'm going to wait for Pope Leo to pull it off or for the bishops to pull it off. We started the show with the sort of religious revivals that we're seeing in different parts of the world, this kind of like counter message to the secularization thesis. I mean, you can use a place like France as just a glimpse of this sort of thing. And talking to priests and other parish leaders, I think you're seeing a similar phenomenon in the United States, although I haven't looked at the numbers precisely. Like in France, in 2025, there were over 10,000 adults who were baptized. That's compared to 3,900 in 2015. So you're seeing this, 4 times as many adult baptisms as a decade ago. And that's that's a sign of life. You saw the Eucharistic Congress here in the United States last summer. You see things like the Sharp pilgrimage that takes place in Europe every year. And a lot of those events are, if you scan the crowd, it's clear that there's this like youth movement that's a part of it all. We have to be agile and ready to present to the world the gifts that God has given us. And I think this emphasis on mystery is, this is where someone with my own liturgical proclivities, I think it's easy for me to jump on this messaging, because what Pope Leo is challenging us with is like, don't use spectacle to fight spectacle. So you see, I think especially like in evangelical communities today, it's like, we'll roll out like drums and pyrotechnics, and even, like the pastor's driving a motorcycle across the stage. There's a certain shallowness to that. It's going to dry up really quickly. It's almost like pop music as opposed to Bach or something like that. Catholic liturgy in its traditional sense and its greatness, it is challenging. It does require a certain level of discipline, even to observe something quietly in a contemplative mode for an hour. Most of us are not used to that sort of thing. But Pope Leo is saying, in part, like, people are hungering for that. They're hungering for the mystery that they can find in the Catholic liturgy. And it's not a task of the Pope. It's a task for each one of us in our time and place to make sure that we're doing what we can to enter into that mystery, but also to share it with others.
Yeah, and I think to wrap up here, another talk he gave gets to this idea where he talked about vocations. He was speaking to the young, but I think he was saying this to all of us, that vocation to mystery as opposed to spectacle and that shallowness. So he goes, let us ask our Heavenly Father to assist us in living in service to one another, each according to his or her state of life, shepherds after his own heart, capable of helping one another to walk in love and truth. And then nearly everyone said, they called this in a particularly animated moment. It's like he got really excited, and he goes, addressed to the young people. To young people I say, do not be afraid, hearkening to John Paul II, accept the invitation of the Church and Christ the Lord. And evidently the crowd went wild. And, so I think, Bud, in this early moments of his papacy, dwelling on what it means to be a shepherd, to be called by Christ, that the resurrected Lord says peace to us, and so that it's our job to think about peace, like as you said, not as like a steady state or falling back or not getting ruffled, but the active work of being a people of the resurrected Lord and entering through mystery in order to do that, instead of the noise, the spectacle, and all of the shallow things that don't let us get into that depth. But it's been like, what, 2 weeks? A week? 1 week.
It's crazy how much we had to talk about today. A lot of grist for the mill, so that's a real gift that I'm grateful for.
Very heartening. Again, I've loved Leo XIII for a long time, so to get a Pope Leo XIV in my lifetime, I got to say, on that alone, pretty excited.
Did you pull some strings? I want to know where Beau Bonner was during the conclave.
I wish I could be accused of getting a cool Pope name. This is The Uncommon Good. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Beau Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We have been in Pope mode all day, so taking a little break, a very small break, Bud, from the religion and technology. But as you said, since we were talking about Pope Leo XIV, because it's so rare that you get a new Pope, so why wouldn't you do it? But we really did talk about religion and technology because he's already worried about it. And what a very heartening thing. But in the middle of a series where we're talking about religion and technology, to hear the new Pope talk about it, pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a key part of his pontificate. As you're writing your dissertation, like one challenge for you is going to be, before it goes to print, or before you send it off to your advisor, like, the Pope mentioned something new about this topic. Pardon me for one slip of the tongue calling him Pope Francis. On the radio, you kind of run into that a lot.
Oh,
you're talking.
I called him Pope Innocent the 14th 3 times on the morning show, so you know where it got near that.
I'm glad I didn't call him John Henry Newman. I'm prone to that sort of thing.
That's right.
But if you're joining us often here on the radio, as we hope you are, we invite you to join us in our prayer life at Iowa Catholic Radio. So 4 a.m, bright and early, we start with the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. That transitions to the Holy Rosary led by Mother Angelica. Later in the morning, we have the Rosary again at 10 a.m., followed by Mass. Of course, right before 3 p.m., the Divine Mercy Chaplet. And you can close out your day by praying the Rosary with Father Groeschel or a recording of his voice. So that takes place at 8:30 p.m. Also, jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app anytime, anywhere to pray the Rosary.
One more time, we want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the Uncommon Good possible. Iowa, a very agricultural state. And so I'm always happy to get to talk about agriculture and animals. Imogene Ingredients is the place you want to go to make sure your livestock grows up healthy, and then I get to eat your livestock, and I grow up healthy. So it's just a great chain of eating, Bud, and it starts with Imogene Ingredients. Thank you for underwriting our show. If you want to make sure to be on the ready to go with whatever Iowa Catholic Radio events are happening, easy to do so. Go to iowacatholicradio.com, hit the events page. You can see that, for instance, Bud, May 21st, the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. I'm sure there are people who want to go out there and show how good they are. You and I, Bud, not one of them, because we are not good. What we're actually better at is praying, and you can go to First Friday Mass every first Friday at 11:30 at Iowa Catholic Radio.
We didn't plan this, but we're ending up going to the Academy of Catholic Theology next week, so actually going to be in spirit at the Golf Classic. But
maybe golf better in spirit than in body.
There'll be a far less divots out on the course with Beau and I. AWOL.
That's it. Yes, dereliction of duty. I don't know if you can be derelict of duty if you're very bad at something.
Well, it's funny because you talk to a lot of guys and they'll say like, "Oh, I'm terrible at golf. But I take it to new levels."
Right.
I don't think in the last 3 years. Well, I should say this: we've maybe used 2 of my shots, and it's best ball.
I think we should probably come up with a new word for worse than terrible to talk about our golf game.
Grave. He has
a grave problem.
His golf game is grave and extreme. No, so First Friday Mass is at the station?
Yep, you can do that every first Friday. We consistently do that. We get priests to come in, so very good. And you can just check out everything at iowacatholicradio.com on the events page. Folks, we don't exist except by the grace of God, of course, but your prayers, your volunteer hours, and then, of course, your donations. So remember that this ministry is not just the people behind the mics, the boards, or the desk. It's your ministry as well. So make sure to contribute to it through your prayers, through your volunteer time, but also through donations. You can call 515-223-1150. Call or text 515-223-1150, or you can go to iowacatholicradio.com. Go over to the donate button to safely donate online. Bud, I hope we did right by the first American Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. I hope people keep praying for him, but an exciting new era in the church.
Yeah, I'm also excited about our new underwriter, Imogene Ingredients. Those guys go to St. Augustine, so I feel like there's a little like parish infusion as well. And like you said, the agriculture piece, just a great underwriter and sponsor for the show.
We are very happy to be underwritten by those. Thank you, guys. This is the Uncommon Good. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.